look at Mark chapter 2 this morning. Mark chapter 2. Now, we've been focusing in on the idea of the gospel. And as you dig into this idea of the gospel, I want us to stop and I want us to think about, we've sung through a series of songs this morning. We've kind of looked at all this. And I want to ask you this question. How has the gospel changed your life? The moment you've been saved, we talk about the idea of some people, they see a radical change. The Bible says, old things are passed away, behold, all things are become new. And you can sometimes see that in someone. They were living a life of crime or a life of sin or a life of depravity, whatever. They get saved and they change and they become a completely different person. My dad tells the story, and I still can't fathom this. He cussed like a sailor and he was just hard drinking and all this stuff, and he gets saved and whole life changes around. And I look at him now and I go, wait, that guy? No, he wasn't that way. And that was him. And for some of you, that's your story. You come out of the idea of the gospel. Christ saves you, and quite literally, you look at who you were before you were saved and who you were after you're saved, and there is this stark, devastating difference. But I remember a buddy of mine, he used to tell the joke. He's like, man, my life story starts out, I was behind bars and I was on the bottle and this and this. And he's like, I mean, it was a crib and it was a milk bottle. But, I was, but some of you, if you were saved at a young age, you don't see that like drastic, unbelievable change. You go from, I was a little kid in Sunday school and I was the next step, a little kid also in Sunday school. In fact, one of the things that tripped me up later in life is I actually got into some sins after I got saved that kind of threw me for a loop. So I was like, I shouldn't be struggling with this. And I came out the other side going like, what am I doing? But I wasn't saved out of those devastating sins and changed. It was, God saved me. I knew God saved me, but then getting into my teen years, I got into some things that I'm ashamed of. And I look back and I go, but I shouldn't have struggled with that. Well, you're also still human. And so I want to ask this question. Think about, what is the main thing that changes when we get saved? What's the main thing that changes when the gospel does its work on us? And there's a lot of outside change. There's a lot of other things like that. But I think you could boil it down to, obviously, our position with God changes. There's an internal change where we are now right with the Lord for the first time ever, and we have access into that holy place. We have access to him through prayer, and we have a place in heaven, and that's just unbelievable right there. But as the gospel works in our life, I hope it's something that starts changing our mindset on things. Yeah. Where we talked last week about the diversity of disciples. And we said you got all these different disciples that follow Jesus. And all these different disciples, I mean, they had different political leanings, they had different motivations, they had different personalities, all these different things that you could look at these disciples, and you could say, okay, at the heart, what was common about all of them? They were all called by Christ, and they were all followers of Christ. But who was the exception? There was one among them that was an exception, and it was Judas. Now, I want you to think about this. Because Judas was a trustworthy individual. I mean, you don't typically hand all the money in the organization to the guy you know to be untrustworthy. And the Bible says that Judas held the bag, which meant he was basically the bookkeeper of the bunch. I'm not sure what the bookkeeper involved. I don't think they had QuickBooks back then, so I'm sure he wasn't entering in, oh, that fish right there, yeah, that goes on this budget line. And I don't think he was doing that, but somehow he kept track of the money to the point that he knew how much stuff would sell for, and he knew other things. And so Judas has this all laid down. The microphone? Yeah. Let me see. Hey, it's muted. It's funny how when you mute a microphone, it doesn't work. My bad. Should I start over? No, I'm just kidding. And so as I want you to think about that, because you have all these different disciples that follow Christ. Several of them are sincerely followers. Most of them are sincere followers. But amongst that lot, you do have one like Judas. And so what I want to do today is I want to take a look at just a few different disciples. And if we do this, I want us to understand this concept that we should not be afraid of conflict. We should not be afraid of conflict. And what I want to do is I want to go through the various disciples of Christ. And I want you to notice how we can take the redemption of the gospel, we can take the truth of the gospel, and we can lay it down over the top of something like conflict and say, we should not be afraid to have a little bit of a disagreement. We should not be afraid to be able to look at the situation and say, that doesn't make sense to me. In fact, as you look at some of these disciples of Jesus, some of them are going to kind of argue a little bit. Some of them are going to make some statements that Jesus is going to call out. But I want you to notice the heart motivation, and I want you to notice how this works out. All right? So again, we're here in Mark chapter 2. Mark chapter 2, again, as we go through the text, Mark chapter 2 is just listing a whole bunch of Jesus' disciples. So let's start there, and then we're going to dig into this story. Jesus is calling disciples. Verse 15, actually we'll start at verse 14. And it says this, and he passed by, he saw Levi the son of Alphaeus, and he says he was sitting at receipt of custom. So what's Matthew doing, Levi here? He's a tax collector. He's working for the Roman government. And Jesus calls unto him and he says what? He says, follow me. All right? And then he rose and he did what he was supposed to do and he follows him. And it came to pass that as Jesus sat at meat in his house, there were many publicans and sinners gathered together, Jesus and his disciples, and they were many, and they followed him. And when the scribes and the Pharisees saw him eat with publicans and sinners, they said unto the disciples, how is it that thou eatest and drinkest with publicans and sinners? And so what they were doing is Jesus was there sitting among these people who were disreputable, and he was basically calling them to the truth. And these Pharisees had a problem with that. They had an issue with that, and so they're calling him to task on it. But I want you to notice that Jesus knows their heart, and Jesus is going to call them to task in return. But not every single person that asks Jesus a question gets the same treatment. Some people who call Jesus to task, he's going to hit them with something. Other people, there's going to be a little bit more of a gentle response. All right? And it says, when Jesus heard that, he said to them, they that are whole have no need of a physician, but they that are sick. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. And the disciples of John and of the Pharisees, they used to fast. And they come and they say unto him, why do the disciples of John and of the Pharisees fast, and your disciples fast not? And so now so the first conflict we have is them saying, hey, what's up? Hey, Mylon, could I ask you not to eat the chips during the middle? Yeah. And so what you've got is right off the bat, Jesus is coming and he's saying, hey, you didn't come to me in a right spirit, so I'm going to kind of give you a truth, but I'm going to give it right back to you. These next group, they're going to come to him and they're saying, hey, how come you don't fast? Hey, how come you don't do things the way we do it? And look what Jesus says. He says, and Jesus said unto him, can the children of the bride chamber fast while the groom is with them? They that have the bridegroom, they cannot fast as long as the bridegroom's with them. Verse 20, the days will come when the bridegroom shall be taken away from them, and those days they shall fast in those days. No man also seweth a piece of new cloth in an old garment. Also he takes the new and he fills up, else the new take piece, I cannot read today, I'm sorry. Else that the new piece that filleth it up taketh away from the old, and the rent is made worse. So no man putteth new wine in old bottles, else the new wine doth burst the bottles. The wine is spilled, and the bottles be marred, but new wine must be put in new bottles. And so Jesus is just answering questions. And so if you come at him with an unrighteous heart, so to speak, if you come at him with this, hey, how come you're doing this? He's going to come back at you, and he's going to tell the truth, but he's going to come back at you a little ways. Then you've got other guys who are going to come with sincere questions. And so you'll got guys like Nicodemus and others who are going to come at night. Zacchaeus, he climbs up in a tree, and he's sitting there watching from the treetop, and he goes, hey, get your house ready. I'm coming to meet with you tonight. You know, and Jesus just has a different way of dealing with each person. But again, I want you to remember the old truth from the Proverbs that says a soft answer turneth away wrath. And so how is Jesus going to respond in a lot of these ways? He doesn't typically respond in anger. He doesn't typically respond in wrath. Why? Because he knows what he's doing. I don't know if you've ever had a conflict with a boss. I don't know if you've ever had one of those awkward conversations. I had a pastor friend of mine who we were out eating at breakfast one time, and he goes, you know, I saved Panera for all of my stressful meetings. And so be thankful we're not eating at Panera today. You know, but you know, I don't know if you've ever had those moments where you're kind of like, I have to sit down and have this uncomfortable conversation, and you feel your hackles rise and you feel the stress level going up. It wasn't that Jesus wasn't human, but the Bible says that only by pride cometh contention. And so when I say we should not shy away from conflict, as in we shouldn't shy away from having these uncomfortable conversations, that's different from contention. The Bible talks about contention as it's strife and it's stirring up trouble. And contention is the attitude where I'm going to come and I don't like you and I'm going to make things worse. Sometimes conflict is just simply, we don't see eye to eye. A good friend of mine and I, when we used to go play escape rooms together, he and I, we got along really, really well. And what we would do is we would operate on the operation of one of us might know something the other doesn't. We both built escape rooms for a living. We both did it for fun. And so we came into the escape room understanding how they were built, how you win them, and the right method to win them. And so what we could do is we could stop everything and say, okay, what do we know? What props do we have we haven't used? What haven't we looked at yet? And we could stop everything in the middle of solving a room, and we could gather all the information, and we could have a back and forth. And it might be I think this puzzle's solved this way. I don't think it's solved that way. I think it's solved this way. But we could have a peaceful conversation. Why? Because we were pulling in the same direction. We could have even a conflict where we sharply disagreed with each other on something. But it never arose to contention because we were pulling in the same direction. And that's what I want you to notice when it comes to the gospel, and when the gospel actually changes heart and the gospel settles into a life. It should allow you to have some conflict with the people around you without it rising to the level of contention. It's going to be a disagreement where you're looking going, I think we'd be better off doing it this way, or I don't quite agree with how you did that. And you're going to have those moments where you're going to kind of come to head on it. But at the end of the day, if the gospel is our focus, we can step back and go, hey, we're still brothers in Christ. We're still pulling in the same direction. We're still trying to get the gospel out. We're still trying to love God, love others, make disciples, as it were. We are still working for that same goal. The moment you're no longer working for that goal, I think it's now going to rise to the level of contention. And isn't that what we see sometimes? It's tragic, but if you look at the story of Paul and Barnabas, what do you see with the story of Paul and Barnabas? You see two brothers who are intimate with each other. I mean, they are traveling, they are connected, they are just bosom buddies. And what happens? Mark wasn't quite that good of a follower. Mark had failed just enough times. Mark had abandoned the cause just enough times. And Paul, being the type of personality that said, I'm sorry, you failed me too many times, I don't trust you. Barnabas was that other personality that was a little bit more forgiving, a little bit more compassionate, a little bit more of the, well, let's just try one more time. We have both of those personalities in the church. We have both of those personalities. We have the guy who goes, I'm willing to give him another shot. And we have the guy who goes, nothing doing. No, ma'am. We are not giving him another shot. How many times does he have to fail us before we go, I'm not trusting you anymore? You understand, for them, they both were concerned about the gospel, but they were both also a little too concerned with doing it their way. And what happened? Barnabas said, I'm taking Mark. Paul said, no, we're not. And so they said that the contention was so sharp between them that they split ways. Now, they would later on make up and reconcile and get back. But I want you to notice that that contention was so sharp that it actually split up brothers in Christ where they could no longer work together. I imagine if you went back over your inventory in your head, you could be like, yeah, I've been that way with people. And I ask you, was it a focus on the gospel that caused that level of contention that split you? Or was it pride? Because look at Paul and Barnabas. That is a hard one, because it's hard to tell who was right and who was wrong. Because there is a level of, you commit to faithful men. And that man was not faithful. There's also we're dealing with broken people in stressful environments, and sometimes we got to give them a little slack. but we've got to also do it with faithful men. And Mark abandoned us just one too many times. I don't think I can trust him. And that's why it's really hard to say who was right in that situation. But you know what happened? There was pride that got involved. They had contention. They split up. But here's where the grace of God stepped in. The grace of God stepped in. And now Barnabas, he does his own ministry, and he works just fine. And Paul goes off on his ministry, and he works just fine. And it's beautiful because later on Mark apparently proved himself, and Paul goes, yeah, that Mark guy, he's not so bad. And so I ask you this, are you afraid of conflict? Because we shouldn't be. And so really quick, let's look at a few other examples. I love this one. Like I said, this is about as close to one of Jesus' disciples getting racist as you could. Look at John chapter 1. I know when I introduce it like that, you're like, what? But I want you to understand, like these are different ethnic, they're not even different ethnic groups. They're like different cities in the same area, all right? So again, it's not necessarily racism, but I want you to think of it like that. Because what this is this is a guy who's looking at where Jesus is from, and he's going, you're from where? All right, and I used the illustration last week. You probably wouldn't understand it unless you're from New Hampshire. But we from New Hampshire do not care too much for people from Massachusetts. I'm sorry if you're from Massachusetts. It's not your fault. You were born there. But we harass people from Massachusetts. Now, at the end of the day, we're still friends, kind of, just as long as you don't come into my state. But we put a sign on the border that said, drive courteously, it's the New Hampshire way. And I mean, we would just do things like that. I'm not sure if it was intentional, but I like to think it was. And we didn't care for people from Massachusetts. And so when I had friends who were from Massachusetts, I would rib them a little bit. That's kind of what Nathaniel is doing here, but in an almost serious way. And so I want you to see this in John chapter 1. Look at this little comment that Nathaniel makes. And this really could lead to conflict. And so I want you to notice this little comment and the conflict that it would raise in you if someone came up to you right now and made a comment about your parents, about where you're from, about something. I mean, just think about it. Somebody walks up to you and insults you on something about where you're from. Imagine your initial response and how you would respond. And it could be your color, your nationality, your ethnicity, your lineage, whatever it is. Like, if somebody walked up and insulted you, what happens? And I want you to notice this because, again, Jesus is there minding his own business. John chapter 1, look at verse 43. And it says, the day following, when Jesus would go forth to Galilee and findeth Philip, he saith unto him, follow me. So he finds this guy by the name of Philip, and he's like, hey, I want you to be one of my disciples. So he's going around, and Jesus is just calling all these different disciples. And we covered most of that last week. And it says, now Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. And back then, sometimes the city you were from actually mattered. Because you grew up there, and you had ancestors there, and you had family there. And I mean, you think about even Jesus going back to Bethlehem, the city of David. Like, it wasn't like today where it's like, well, the house is cheaper over there in that town. I don't even know where the border is. I'm going to move over to that town. No, like back then, it was a big deal where you were from. And so there's a little bit of a rivalry here. There's a little bit of a contention, if you will. And look what happens. He calls Simon and Andrew and Philip, and he says, we have found the Messiah, which being interpreted is the Christ. Verse 32, and he brought him to Jesus, and when Jesus beheld him, he said, thou art Simon, son of Jonah, but from this point on, you shall be called Cephas. So he gives him a new name, which by interpretation is a stone. And the following day, Jesus goeth forth to Galilee, and he findeth Philip, and he says, follow me. Now Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. And Philip findeth Nathanael, and he saith unto him, we have found him, of whom Moses and the law and the prophets write, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. And look what Nathanael says. And again, put yourself in the shoes, these little snide comments, and just think about how that would raise your hackles. Think about how that would be like, those are fighting words. Like, don't you dare. You know, I've told you the story about the person who insulted my mom. And I kind of was like, I'm not a fighter, but you just insulted my mom out of the blue. Like, I might make an exception. You're like, I didn't. Don't worry. But you get it. Like, when somebody insults something essential to who you are, yeah. So look what Nathanael does. Nathanael just out of the blue goes, can there any good thing come out of Nazareth? You know, it's like, oh, yeah, you're from that town. Has anything good come out of that town? I mean, you can hear it. And so Nathanael makes that comment, but I want you to notice how Jesus responds. And Jesus saw Nathanael, and he said, behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom is no guile. And so Jesus just deflects it. He takes the insult, or he takes the little snide comment, and he just goes, wow, you speak your mind, don't you? You're an Israelite indeed. Boy, you got no guile, do you? I mean, you think about it, like little children do this, where they just come out and they're like, how come that guy's got that big thing on his nose? And you're like, and it's like, wow, aren't you an honest one? And Jesus just looks at Nathanael and he goes, Nathanael, okay. But I want you to notice this, that Nathanael says, how do you know who I am? He says, like, do we know each other? And look what Jesus says. He answers and he says to him, before that Peter called thee, when thou wast under the fig tree, I saw thee. And I want you to notice this because for the sake of the gospel and for the sake of calling disciples, what does Jesus do? He overlooks this snide little comment. He overlooks this insult. And what does he do? He goes, hey, Nathanael, I know who you are. I'm going to say something positive about you. You're without guile, I'll give you that. And Nathanael's going, how do we know each other? And he goes, yeah, before Philip called you, I saw where you were sitting and I saw what you were doing. He shouldn't have known that. And so look what, again, the reason we know he shouldn't have known that is the next verse. Nathanael answered unto him, going, Rabbi, thou art the Son of God. Thou art the King of Israel. And so for the focus of the gospel, what did Jesus do? He didn't escalate that little conflict to contention. He didn't get into a fight. He didn't get into a tizzy. He just deflected it. And for the sake of the gospel, he was able to make peace. And look at what happens. He gets a disciple. And that disciple, just from that little comment, could testify, this is the one we've been waiting for. This is the one we have. And so I think Nathanael's a really, really cool pattern. There's another one, and we won't turn there, but remember Peter. Peter had no shortage of moments that we could go through in the life of Peter. Peter, somebody joked, he had a mouth shaped like a foot because he just kept putting it in there. But Peter, he has those moments where you just constantly see Peter messing up. He's constantly, let's think about it. He gets to one point where Jesus says, I am going to go die, and Peter grabs him and says, far be it from you, Lord. I don't know if you've ever thought about doing that to God, where if God were standing in front of you, you would grab him and go, what are you doing? That was Peter, though. Like, Peter was just very forthright, very forcible. You saw it where Jesus said, hey, all of you are going to deny me. And Peter goes, though everyone would, I wouldn't. And you notice what Jesus, he looks at Peter and he warns him and he says, Peter, Satan has desired to sift you like wheat. But I'm praying for you that when it happens, your faith holds. And again, if you've ever been contradicted in public like that, if anyone's tried to publicly shame you, your initial reaction is a bristle, the come back at them. But what does Jesus do? He goes, I'm praying for you. Like, I don't think you understand the road that you're on. I don't think you understand. And so for Nathanael makes the snide comment about Jesus' lineage, and Jesus just goes, hey, I know who you are. For Peter outright contradicts him to his face, and what does Jesus do? He goes, listen, the path you're on is going to lead to this location, and you will not like what you find there. And so I want to take you to a verse in Proverbs, because there's a verse in Proverbs that brings this to the head. I think if I were to put all of us in a bucket, and I were to take each one of us and put us in one of two buckets, we are either the type of person who avoids conflict as a matter of course, where we say, I am just going to find a way not to have to get in someone's face on this, and our natural tendency is to not be the conflict person. That's one bucket that some of us would be put in. We're just we don't enjoy that side of things. The other side, they're the type who are like, let's just take this bull by the horns and let's just take care of it now. And they're going to be the type who just kind of grab onto something by the face. I heard someone describe it, he was talking about his dad and he's like, my dad's the type, he won't pass a stray dog without taking a kick at it. Like that's just kind of his personality. He just, and God has given some people that personality that they don't shy away from conflict, and it's like, bring it on. And so if I were to put all of us in a bucket, I think we'd fall into one of those two. Like, we avoid it like the plague, or we dive in with both feet. And there's a lot to learn on both sides. Let's just say that. But I want you to notice this, because to this group right here that avoids conflict like the plague, and they're like, I don't dare, I just don't want people to dislike me or whatever. I want you to look at Proverbs chapter 27, because I think Proverbs chapter 27 has a powerful message to talk to us about, and I think we can see it here in Jesus' response to Peter. Because what Jesus could have done with Peter when Peter got in Jesus' face is Jesus could have just said, well, you'll see. Okay, cool, whatever. He could have ignored him. And there were times, genuinely, that people would say things to Jesus and Jesus would walk away. He didn't always pick a fight. He knew when it was right and when it wasn't. But I want you to think about this, because in Proverbs chapter 27, look at verse 5. And again, we understand from our Sunday night study, Proverbs is not always a narrative. Sometimes there's verses around that will add some insight, but sometimes Proverbs is just kind of a one and done. So Proverbs is one of those, you do have to be careful about not taking things out of context. But I do want you to know what verse 4 says and kind of the lead up to verse 5. Verse 4 says, wrath is cruel and anger is outrageous, but who is able to stand before envy? And so if you think about what wrath and anger are, is they're kind of the outward expression of being dissatisfied with someone. They're the outward expression of, I don't like you, and this is how I'm going to show it. But what's the internal manifestation of disliking someone? It's envy. Because wrath and anger are the, I'm going to destroy you very openly. Envy is the, I'm just going to kind of subtly hope you get destroyed because I don't like you. Or I like what you have so much, I wish I had it instead of you. But what is wrath? They're kind of two sides of the same coin. Like, wrath and anger are a little bit more open. Envy is a little bit more secret. But then, with that said, look at the very next verse. Because it says, open rebuke is better than secret love. Now think about that. We would all say that love is a pretty good thing. If you've, it's like that, oh, I love you so much, will you be my, the check yes or no, and we all like, oh, that's so cute, and secret love is one of those things that we would look at and go, okay, I mean, that's cute, and secret love is great and all, but what does love actually look like when two people run into each other? What does love manifest actually look like? Like if we were going to talk chemistry, and I said, there's a chemical reaction, and that chemical reaction is involving love. What's it going to look like? If I mix these two chemicals, it's an explosion. If I mix these two chemicals, it's a smoke. If I mix these two chemicals, it changes color. What does secret love look like? And so secret love might be that thing where you slip secret notes to the secret person, or you're slipping secret things, or you're doing all this secret stuff because you're kind of embarrassed for it to be publicly known. But look what the Bible says. It says open rebuke. So me openly calling you out is better than me leaving you a secret love note. How does that work? Well, I think it looks like this. If I love you genuinely, if I truly care for you and I love the people around you, I am not going to let you stay in your sin. I'm not going to let you stay doing that dangerous thing. We'll put it in a very common understanding. I was with a friend of mine. We were at a fair. And you know how fairs have those giant outdoor cooking stoves. And this one happened to be made of brick. And it was a massive brick wall. It stood about this tall, and it was just filled with coals and other stuff. And you can imagine how hot those bricks could get. And so you have this massive brick wall that ran this long length. And I'm standing there with a buddy of mine, and there's this little kid over here toddling his way toward what looks like a brick wall. Now, if I love that child, what is the love that child going to manifest in my actions? I'm going to protect them. And so what I'm going to do is I'm not going to sit there and write a secret note and be like, oh man, I really hope that child doesn't touch that hot stove. Oh man, like that, I'm watching it and I'm really concerned. It hurts me to watch that child go toward that stove. No, you know what my friend did to show how much he cared for that child? That child's toddling his way toward the hot stove, and my friend yelled at him. He was like, watch out, hot! And the kid's like, cries a little bit, stumbles his way back to his parents, and it's like, that was the most loving thing that guy could have done at that moment. And that kid could have stopped and argued, but he was a little kid. He didn't understand how to argue at that point. He didn't have anything to throw either, so he didn't do that part of arguing. And so what did the kid do? The kid turned around, cried, wandered his way back to his parents. It was the most loving thing my friend could do to openly rebuke that child so the child did not stumble into a hot stove and hurt himself. Sin is like that. And what does Jesus do to Peter? He openly rebukes Peter before them all and says, you're on a road that is going to hurt you. Later on, Peter and Paul, they get into a conflict because the sake of the gospel is at stake. And he's saying, you are putting burdens on people that are not fit to bear, and you're not even living by it, Peter. And for the sake of the gospel, Paul and Peter come to butt heads, but it's for the sake of the gospel. It wasn't out of pride. Paul was not coming to Peter, and Jesus was not coming to Peter and just going, we just see things differently, and I hate you for it. No, they were coming and saying, you're about to get yourself in some serious trouble. Let me correct you. And he did it lovingly, and he did it with concern, and he did it for the sake of the gospel, and that's why we sometimes feather our response to care for people. And so I want you to see that because that's Peter. But then I want you to look at one last illustration and look at John chapter 12. Because in John chapter 12, we see one, and there's no shortage of illustrations I could have gone to, but for sake of time, John chapter 12, and I want you to see this because here you've got a situation in John chapter 12 where a woman in just simple gratitude comes and does this absolutely extreme thing. And again, I asked you that question at the beginning of the service. I said, when you got saved, when you trusted Christ as your Savior, what changed? What happened in your life? And for some of you, you can look and you can say, you have no idea what I came out of. And what Christ saved me from and the change He made in my life, I cannot begin to even describe it to you. And I was talking with a guy even yesterday, and we were talking about, the work of Christ in his life. And he was like, man, there's sometimes I just, I get talking about Jesus and I start tearing up. The work Jesus has done in his life and the things that God has done. And he's like, yeah, it makes me emotional. And that's where this lady is. And she's simply coming with that heart attitude of, thank you. Thank you for what you did for me. Thank you for delivering me from the bondage of my sin. Thank you for this thing you did for me. And so she comes and she's doing this absolutely insane thing to Christ. But I want you to notice her response, and I want you to notice the traitor Judas's response. And look at how Jesus responds to both of them. And so look at what happens here in John chapter 12. It says that now Jesus was 6 days before the Passover. So he's coming up. It's right end time. He's going to die soon. Okay? So this is the final week of his life. It's done. We're wrapping it all up. And so just imagine if you knew someone was going to die in 1 week, how would you treat them different? I think about it a lot. My grandpa said, he's like, man, anyone who's been in a car accident, if they could take back the last 10 seconds before that car accident, and they could change that last 10 seconds before that thing happened, what would you change? And I think about that a lot. When I'm about to do something unsafe behind the wheel, I go, what if this is the last 10 seconds before I crash into someone? But I want you to think about that. If you had one more week with someone, and you knew you had a week left, how would it change how you show your love to them? Now, I don't know for sure that she knew Jesus was going to die later on that week. But it points out the detail that this is 6 days before the Passover. This is right before the end, and look what it does. It says, right before Passover, where Lazarus was, which had been dead, whom he had raised from the dead. So there's a whole lot of gratitude in this house. There's a whole lot of thankfulness. There's a whole lot of, wow, I would still be possessed by demons. You'd still be dead. I mean, talk about a change, man. Like, this is awesome. And they're going through. And verse 2, and they made supper, and Martha served, but Lazarus was one of them that sat at the table with him. Then took Mary a pound of ointment of spikenard, very costly. Now we find out later this is about a year's worth of value. So you think about an item like a bottle of perfume that took you a year's wages to earn. And you're just going to dump all of it in one fell swoop. That's what's going on here. And so look what Mary does. She takes it. She takes the bottle of ointment of spikenard, very costly, anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the odor of ointment. And so she's doing some things here that are potentially shameful. In that culture, women, you don't show your hair. You don't just randomly grab onto someone's feet. You don't do this type of stuff. But she's so overwhelmed in her gratitude that she pours out this whole ointment, and she doesn't have a rag to wash his feet with, so she just takes her own hair and starts wiping his feet clean with her hair. Again, that would be looked on as shameful. She was willing to bear the shame because she just wanted to show her gratitude in any way she possibly could. And I want you to notice the response of the so-called disciple of Jesus. Look at what Judas says. Then said one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, which should betray him, why was not this ointment sold for 300 pence and given to the poor? You know, it's one of those things, if you've ever put your heart and soul into a project and someone comes and they're like, there's one thread loose right here. And you're like, I joked with someone, I said there was one time I planned a whole event from stem to stern, put all the pieces together, and I was talking to someone after, and I was like, so how did it go? And they're like, well, you forgot your pens. And I was like, yep, you're right. I forgot the pens for that sign-up. Did you see the rest of the stuff that I did? And noted, thank you. I mean, he was right. But it was one of those things, like if you've ever had that, where you've just put your heart and soul into someone, and someone comes on and they're like, a little bit of dirt here. You're like, oh, I'll show you a little bit of dirt. And you're like, but that's what happens. Mary comes and she pours out a year's worth of value on his feet, and she doesn't have a towel, so she bears the shame of wiping it up with her own hair, and there's this guy who's supposedly a follower of Christ who's standing there pompously in the corner going, could have made a whole lot of money for the poor with that. I want to hit you. I mean, that, like, what on earth? How is that your first response? Your first response would be, I wish I could show my love that much. I wish I had some way to do that too. And look what Jesus does. Jesus doesn't criticize her for showing her hair in public. He doesn't criticize her for touching him without permission. He doesn't do anything. Look what Jesus does. Verse 7. Jesus says, let her alone. Leave her alone. Against the day of my burying has she kept this. For the poor you always have with you, but me you do not have always. So is Jesus saying we should break up all of our valuable stuff and throw it at the church building? No. Go ahead, sell it, make money, give it to the church, do whatever. But he's saying right there, in that moment, the best thing she could have done with that is to do what she did. Yes, that money could have been given to the poor, but guess what? There's always going to be poor, and there's always going to be money to give to the poor. So This is a special moment. Let it be special. And that's what he does. Verse 9, much people of the Jews therefore knew that he was there, because you couldn't help but probably smell him. And they came not for Jesus' sake only, but that they might see Lazarus also, whom he hath raised from the dead. And it said, but the chief priests consulted that they might put Lazarus to death, because that by reason of him many of the Jews went away and believed on Jesus. And later we find out that Judas kind of gets it set in his heart too to betray Jesus around this time. And so let me ask you just a simple question. We look at Jesus' response to all these conflicts. And we look at Jesus' response to Peter, and Jesus' response to Nathanael, and Jesus' response to Mary, and even Jesus' response to Judas. And what do you see in every one of these situations is Jesus is focused in on the gospel, what is going to further the gospel, what's going to further the kingdom. And so he gets slighted because of where he's from. And what does he go? Well, you have no guile, do you? Wow. And Jesus doesn't take offense. He goes, hey, I know who you are. I saw you under that tree. And when Peter comes and says, I'll never betray you, Jesus goes, you will. But I'm actually praying for you because your faith is about to be severely shaken. And then Mary comes and does this, what we would look at as shameful thing. And Jesus goes, it was done for the sake of my burial. Leave her alone. She meant well. And then Judas comes and he goes, oh, well, I could have given all that money to the poor. But Jesus knew his heart. He knew he wasn't really concerned with the poor. One of the other disciples points it out and says, Judas was just concerned about pocketing the money anyway. But even if Judas were just concerned about the poor, Jesus is going, no. Right now, the most important thing she could have done is serve. And that's what she did. Leave her alone. Now let me close with one final illustration because I want you to see this, because when Jesus returns, he comes to the seashore and he actually restores Peter back to his place. Jesus loved Peter enough, and he loved the investment that he had made in Peter enough that he goes to Peter and he says, Peter, hey, do you love me? And remember, Peter just came off of denying Christ 3 times. He said, I don't know the guy. I don't know him. I don't know him. And what does Jesus do? He comes to Peter 3 times and says, hey, Peter, hey, do you love me? And what does Peter do? He's like, I like you. Okay, Peter, do you love me? You know I do, Lord. And he goes, Peter, do you love me? And he restores Peter back to fellowship with him. He doesn't give in. He doesn't come back and throw it in Peter's face. Peter knows. Peter knows where he failed. Peter doesn't need it smacked every single time he opens his mouth. And that's the beauty of what forgiveness looks like. Because what is forgiveness but you wronged me, but for the sake of the gospel and for the sake of the glory of the kingdom, I forgive you. Now, there's going to have to be a restoration of fellowship here. I can't just let you back in where you left. I mean, there's obviously some restoration, but there's a forgiveness here that says, I'm not going to hold that against you. And we've talked about forgiveness, so insert notes from there into this conversation. But I want you to see that that is how you avoid contention, even amidst the conflict that we're no doubt going to have. And I think if we cross this church, and we looked across this church, and I said, what is the thing that matters most to you about politics, and you about politics, and you about politics? I mean, we could start a war. It would be dramatic, and it would be fun. But for the sake of the gospel, there's a lot of things that we say, you know what, I get it. You believe passionately about that, and I believe passionately about that. I really think we should serve burgers every day, and I just disagree that you think we should serve hot dogs. We see differently on that. But for the sake of the gospel, let's overlook it. I know some things are more serious than hot dogs and hamburgers, but you get my point. But this is where our conflicts should all center around, hey, let's do the gospel better. Let's spread the gospel better. Let's serve the Lord better. And we have the humility to not let those conflicts arise into a full-blown contention that would cause a Paul and a Barnabas to go separate ways, or cause a Peter to betray Christ. But again, you don't avoid the conflict. Open rebuke is better than secret love. Let's close in prayer.